Yeah, this is going to be a rant. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to another one of my videos, which I want to talk about political issues. So if that isn't something you want to talk about or hear me talk about on the BookTube channel, feel free to skip this video. I've had less time to read this week, so I haven't made a lot of reading progress, but I have had a lot of time to sit around and think. And these are the things I've been thinking about. And the main kind of thing I realized, I was thinking about with the three issues I'm going to talk about today, is whether or not we are seeing signs for hope or we're seeing further signs for despair. Because I think you can look at the major events of, like, let's say the last week or so in kind of two different ways. And I'll kind of tell you which direction I'm leaning at the end of this. So I want to look at three big things that have happened in the news just over the last few days, last week or so. The first is the end of the government shutdown. On Sunday night of this week, enough Democratic and independent senators agreed to vote for the Republicans' continuing resolution, which, does not restore government subsidies for health care under the ACA, which will result in the doubling, tripling, or increased costs of health insurance for everybody, which will cause many people to lose their health insurance, and then since they can't afford it, those 8 Democratic independent senators voted the Republicans, and the government was able to open back up. A lot of people on my side of the political spectrum were really angry at these Democratic senators for caving, and to a certain extent, I'm angry about it too. And maybe it's because I'm jaded or cynical. I really didn't expect that Trump would ever give in, that Trump and the Republicans would give in and, re-up or go ahead and okay continuing these ACA subsidies, because I don't think the Trump and the Republican Party care anything about people who are so close to the bottom of the socioeconomic pyramid that they can't afford health insurance without the ACA. So, how do I see this thing, which I see, as an example of perhaps political cowardice and giving in to the authoritarianism of Trump? How do I see this as positive? Well, there are a couple of things about it that I think are positive, or we have worked out to be positive. One, part of the deal was that the continuing resolution guarantees SNAP benefits through 2026. So, the next time we have a continuing resolution to keep the government funded, and that will be, I believe, January 30th of next year, the next time that happens, SNAP benefits won't be able to be used as leverage. Republicans and Trump won't be able to use SNAP benefits as leverage in that fight. In addition to that, government jobs were restored. One of the things the Trump administration did when the shutdown took place, said, great, we wanted to fire all these government employees anyway, and they started doing that. Those jobs will be given back, and that's a good thing for working people. In a general sense, we were getting to the point where air traffic control was becoming a major problem. We saw flights canceled, big problems at the airports, and certainly the government opening back up has, relieved that, and all the people who were laid off or not getting paid for their government jobs are going to get that back paid. These are all good things. These are all good things because they help real people. They help real people. I know what you're saying. Yes, they help real people, but many of those same people are going to be hurt by the lack of government subsidies, and I definitely think that that's true. What I would argue is that in a minimal way, the deal those Democratic and independent senators cut with the Republicans to open the government back up decrease Republican leverage, and therefore they will increase Democratic leverage come January. That at the very least, that's what's happening. And in addition to that, and this is just a purely political thing, so it doesn't do anything about the harm that's going done to real people. But from a purely political point of view, Republicans are going to have to vote to say they do not want to help people who are going to lose their insurance, that they do not want to help keep insurance costs low. They're going to have to actually vote on that. And that is, going to be a really bad issue for them in the 2026 elections. Does that help people who are going to be without insurance? It does not. Does that mean that their people are going to suffer and die because they don't have access to health insurance in the United States, health care in the United States? It absolutely does. Does that mean that our hospital emergency rooms are going to be put under even more pressure and financial pressure? It absolutely does. Does it mean that lots of rural hospitals and clinics will find they can't stay open and closed, leaving millions of people in rural areas without health care or access to a hospital? It absolutely does. And, that's real hurt and that's real pain. The only hope in it is that it's such real pain that that I think it will make Republicans and Trump pay a political cost in 2026. So that sounds like I'm talking about something that's hopeful that isn't very hopeful. And now I'm going to throw the despair part on it because here's the thing. The thing that was most disturbing to me about the shutdown isn't that enough Democrats and independents caved and voted to reopen the government, is that it proved the extent of the cruelty of Trump and the Republican Party. He did not for a moment entertain the idea of negotiating with Democrats to open back up the government. He did not allow Republican senators to really negotiate on the issue of ACA subsidies. He got his, hand puppet, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, to essentially keep the House of Representatives closed for 5 weeks during this shutdown, so that nothing could be done, so no negotiation could take place. And he did that knowing the economic damage it would do. When a court ruled that his administration had to pay out SNAP benefits because there's an emergency fund built into SNAP benefits in case of government shutdown, so that hungry kids and hungry people don't go hungry, Trump actually went to court and fought for the right to deny SNAP benefits, to deny food to hungry people. He actually did that. He was willing to let the economy collapse because of the problems happening at our nation's airports. And that level of cruelty, I think, surprised even Democratic senators and surprised a lot of people, that he would be willing to wreck everything so that he could, in effect, raise everybody's health insurance costs. I mean, that's a dumb thing to wreck the economy over. I'm so determined, this is Trump's position. He was so determined to cut ACA benefits because he hates ACA because he calls it Obamacare. He's so determined to kill that program that he's literally willing to kill Americans, and he's willing to crash the economy during his presidency to get that done. That is a level of cruelty. That is a level of awfulness I don't think we've ever seen from the President of the United States or from the ruling, controlling party of the United States of America. And that is a really bad thing. But I do think, and the bad consequences of that for health insurance are going to take place, but I do think there's another seemingly unrelated but related thing that came out of that, which might be another reason for hope. So the second thing that's come up this week after the government's opened is that we now have, Mike Johnson. So this is kind of esoteric, I guess, political stuff. But because the Senate passed a version of the continuing resolution that wasn't exactly like the House's version of the continuing resolution, that forced Mike Johnson, Trump's hand puppet, Speaker of the House of Representatives, to call the House back into session because they have to vote to make sure that their version of the continuing resolution is the exact same as the Senate version. So they had to come back into session and vote. This removed his excuse for why he had not sworn in the newly elected member of the House of Representatives from Arizona. Her last name is Grijalda. He had to swear in, and when he did that, she represented the 218th vote, and that's enough votes to force a vote on the House of Representatives through a discharge position on releasing the Epstein Files. So one of the unintended, or one of the, what I'm going to say, are the unintended consequences of the Democratic senators giving in the Senate and reopening the government was it forced Mike Johnson to reopen the House of Representatives. It forces him to swear in Representative Grijalda, and that then leads to forcing this vote on releasing the Epstein Files. Well, it just so happens, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, political games, Democrats who are on the House Oversight Committee who've had access to these emails from the Epstein estate. These are not the Epstein Files. These are not emails that are necessarily in the Epstein Files that the FBI and the DOJ control, but they then released 3 emails from Jeffrey Epstein which indicate that Trump, at the very least, knew what Jeffrey Epstein was up to. he is denied knowing anything about Epstein's, child sex trafficking ring or any of that kind of stuff are being involved. But at least these emails indicate that he knew about it, that he knew what Epstein was up to, and they may indicate that Epstein had some kind of blackmail material over him. So now we have the vote to discharge for the discharge position that will bring the vote on the House, force the House to vote to release the Epstein files, which means every single member of the House will have to say yes, release the files, no, release the files, and it'll be on record. If it passes the House, which it looks like it will go to the Senate, where the Senate, every senator will have to say yes, release the Epstein files so we can know the truth, or no, don't release the Epstein files and keep covering for Trump. And if both the House and the Senate pass it, it'll actually go to President Trump, and he'll have the opportunity to sign it into law, and he'll have to say definitively, no, don't release the files. Now, if you're asking me, are the files ever going to be released under the system? No, but it will force Republicans to take those votes. And I think that is a positive thing, because one of the positives, and again, this is a purely political positive. There is nothing positive about the story of Jeffrey Epstein and his abuse of these little girls, about child sex trafficking, about the fact that our president may be implicated in that, the fact that he's hiding these files from the American people, and he continues, to want to go along with that. There is nothing good in this. But from a political point of view, this is another divisive issue which now Republicans are going to be forced to vote on. They're going to be forced to have to vote on increasing your health care costs and putting their name next to that, and they're going to be forced to have to vote on whether or not to release the Epstein files. And all of these things weaken Trump's presidency. So, to me, that's a hopeful thing, just from a political point of view. One of the things that I think is true in the United States today is that for us to move forward and get past this really black period in American history that we're in, Trump has to be weakened to the point that Republicans will abandon him. And I think these two votes are likely to help, shift the ground in that direction. This will have all kinds of positive benefits. Maybe the House and the Senate will start standing up to him more often. Really hidden way back a while ago, the Senate actually voted that they had the power to assess tariffs and not Trump. That was a little bit of a stand up to him in this kind of, during the shutdown, he wanted them to break the filibuster and just change the rules so they could pass the continuing resolution by, simple majority vote. They refused to do so, which means they, told Trump no. These are all good things. The weaker Trump gets, the better it is for, all of us here in the United States of America and the future of democracy. What is despairing about the Epstein files is the extent that Trump is willing to go to keep those files hidden. This from a man who ran on the idea of releasing the files. This from a man who was supported by all the Epstein file conspiracy theorists who were just looking forward to the Epstein list coming out, and because Trump said he would do that, and then when he came into office, his DOJ basically said, hey, Don, you're all over the Epstein files and it doesn't look good. And so they just said, okay, we're not going to release the Epstein files. The extent to which he's willing to go to keep covering that up is extraordinary. He called Lauren Boebert in. She is one of the Republicans in the House who signed the discharge petition to bring the vote on whether or not to release the Epstein files to a vote on the House floor. He called her in to try to pressure her into changing her vote, to vote against, releasing the files, vote against releasing the files when that vote comes up next week. And he was so serious about this that he took her into, along with, Pam Bondi and Kash Patel and other people from DOJ, they went into the White House Situation Room. This is the ultra-secretive room in which you cannot record things and, nobody can secretly listen in, so that there's no record other than what anybody's willing to say about what went on there, in an effort to pressure her to change her vote. That's how desperate he is. He is that desperate to prevent this from coming to light. And to me, that indicates that there is something in those files that he is desperate for the American people not to know. We should not have a president who had a connection to the most notorious pedophile and child sex trafficker in the United States of America. We should not have a person like that in the White House who is working as hard as Trump is to not release information and not to ensure justice for the victims of Jeffrey Epstein. And that's what we have in Trump. And that is becoming more and more evident. I think, if you didn't know how depraved and how cowardly and how corrupt Trump was, I think this is a dead giveaway. And then the third thing that will happen this week, which I think was a sign, we can read as a sign of hope or an indication of despair, is that a judge ruled that hundreds of people who had been arrested in the Chicago and the Midwest area by ICE had to be released because their arrests had been illegal. This is what we want. We want the court standing up for our rights, the rights of citizens and non-citizens, to guarantee that they are treated according to the 4th, 5th, 6th Amendment by the United States government. This is the court essentially saying what ICE is doing is tyrannical. What ICE is doing is a violation of the Constitution, and they can't do that. So because they've arrested people using these methods, they have to let them go. That is a hopeful sign. One of the things that I think will be an indication that we are beyond the pale of the Constitution is if the courts and the state governments as a whole knuckle under to Trump. We've seen, unfortunately, the United States Supreme Court seems to be willing to grant Trump some extraordinary powers and privileges, and we'll see how that goes, unfortunately. But there is still evidence of resistance from within the government. The governments of the state of Illinois and Oregon and Washington are fighting against Trump. The courts at the lower level are fighting against Trump. It remains to be seen what the Supreme Court will do here. But recently, the Supreme Court refused to even take a case in which they would reevaluate the legality of same-sex marriage. To me, this is a hopeful sign. And so, what I see going on with ICE is that the ICE raids are becoming incredibly they are incredibly unpopular, that more and more people are outraged, disgusted by the way in which ICE is going about its job, that they are actually hurting people, that they are causing physical damage, they've killed people, they are because the Supreme Court wrongheadedly allowed them to racially profile the people they're looking for, they are in fact arresting and imprisoning citizens and people who are allowed to be here, who have documentation to be here, as well as undocumented immigrants. And that we've seen this resistance, the protests going on are incredibly effective at changing people's mind. And one of the things I want to point out that's made those protests so effective is that for the most part, they are non-violent protests. When you see Trump say Portland is a city on fire, and there are all these riots going on in Portland, and that this is going to, maybe allow him to send the military in to Portland to regain control of the city, and then you contrast that with the images of the protesters in blow-up dinosaur suits, or out there just singing and dancing and protesting in front of the ICE facility, you realize how much of a lie Trump is telling. And that message gets through. And so I think that's hopeful. I think the power of citizens and protests and nonviolent protests for the moment are having the desired political effect. The despair half of this issue is that Stephen Miller, who really is running this thing, Trump is evil and he's going along with it. But the real, idea man behind these mass deportations is Stephen Miller, the pocket Goebbels who is running this whole thing. He said he wants to ramp up deportation arrests to 3,000 a week, which means these raids are going to get worse. And as they get worse, the protests need to, and the documentation of what's happening need to go on those same levels. So, this to me is a cause for despair because it indicates that things are going to get worse before they get better. And this then brings me to kind of my overall take on whether or not this week is a reason for hope or despair. And you probably picked up on this, but I'm going to say this week is a reason for hope. They're hard to come by if you're not MAGA. They're hard to see these signs of hope that are taking place, but I think they're there. We're seeing the American people stand up. We're seeing the consequences of the Republican Party's lockstep devotion to whatever Trump says. It's going to come back and bite them hard. We are seeing Trump more and more exposed for what he is. We're seeing, I think in a small way, positive results of Democratic Party resistance, even with the caving in and opening the government back up. I think there are things that they won from that will have real consequences. And I suspect that if the Republicans don't work with the Democrats to restore ACA subsidies here in December, we're going to be right back in that shutdown space when the continuing resolution comes up in January, where I think Republicans and Trump will have less leverage, and I think Trump will be even weaker, and we might see more Republicans affection from the cult of Trump. At least that's what I hope. But on the whole, I think we are seeing a real weakening of Trump, his popularity and his hold on the Republican Party, and that can't help but be a good thing. Anyway, there you go. If you have different thoughts or want to share any comments in the comment section below, please feel free to do so. And as always, thank you for watching.